Center, and he's all right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're kicking off an online event series we've titled New Name, Same Flaws, Examining Biden's Misguided Domestic Extremism Strategy. The series will be Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific. I'm Cody Bloomfield from Defending Rights and Dissent, and we're very lucky to have Harsha Panduranga as our first guest here today. Harsha is here to explain what some of these countering domestic extremism programs do and why they harm communities, suppress dissent, and reinforce white supremacy. Harsha is counsel at the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program, and he researches how the government targets Muslim communities under the guise of counterterrorism. Recently, he's put out an excellent report explaining why President Biden's new domestic terrorism strategy won't actually prevent white supremacist violence. Biden's new strategy recycles a lot of the playbook from the war on terror and maintains the same problems of ideological policing, speculative surveillance, and criminalization of innocuous behavior. And there's every chance that the new strategy, while targeted at white supremacists, will continue to target communities of color. Harsha has kindly joined us to give us a rundown of these programs, to explain the nuts and bolts, and about how they reinforce white supremacy. All right, without further ado, Harsha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Cody. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, first off, could you explain what the heck the CP3 program is? We're now in the third iteration of CVE programs, and it's a lot of acronyms, and I think it's helpful to outline what exactly CP3 is and what it does.
Yeah, functionally, the CP3 program is the second rebrand of a program called Countering Violent Extremism. And the common framework underlying these programs is essentially there are risk factors and signs that make a person more disposed to committing a terrorist attack or act of violence, and signs that they're about to commit it. So, far before something becomes, the legitimate matter of a criminal investigation. And these signs are often very broad or vague. So, some combination of being socially alienated, for example, having mood swings, maybe getting in a fight with a classmate, given that a lot of the programs are focused on children, having a grievance, having what is considered an extreme view, among many other things. Mainly the problem is that sort of serves as a predicate for potential law enforcement involvement in deciding what to do with the person, and often what the indicia reveal are more reflective of social conditions. In terms of historically, where does the CP3 program come from? I mentioned the program Countering Violent Extremism, and that program was much more heavy-handed in its targeting, meaning that it focused almost exclusively on Muslims, and earlier initiatives fitting into this violence prevention paradigm, were overtly prejudiced, not only in terms of, for example, doing outreach specifically to a Muslim or Somali community, for example, essentially suggesting that community was more predisposed to terrorism than any other, but also even in those signs that they use. Now they're a little bit more neutral, like some of the ones that I mentioned above, but previously they included things like, are you going to mosque more? Are you, frequently traveling to a Muslim country? Do you have concerns about human rights around the globe? I mean, these are real warning signs that were used. So basically, the current iteration of the program removes some of that, heavy-handed kind of targeting as a basis for, potential law enforcement involvement, interest, or referral, and replaces them with these kind of vaguer, broader signs applicable to, large segments of the population.
Thank you. And would you mind running through a couple of examples of programs that have been funded through CP3 or previous CVE iterations, just to give people a sense of the kind of research and social program the government's funding under counterterrorism?
Yeah, and one way to conceptualize it is through the paradigm that the government posits, although it's not one that's on solid empirical footing. Essentially, that there is a pathway to someone committing an act of violence that starts, kind of early on when they might be exposed to certain risk factors that make them more likely to commit an attack. So, for example, if a risk factor is being socially alienated or cut off from your community, or not having good access to employment or education, then an initiative in this vein. Now, remember, coming out of a security agency like the Department of Homeland Security and not Department of Education or anything else, would be to fund like an after-school initiative, as one of the grants for fiscal year 2020 does. Basically, it funds a youth academy for youth of quote unquote diverse backgrounds to help them learn leadership skills and be more civically engaged. That's on kind of the earlier side. In the middle, you've got essentially training of community members, in particular law enforcement. The grant program is only one component of a range of CP3 initiatives, but 13 out of the 29 fiscal year 2020 CP3 grants went to law enforcement, training law enforcement, community members, teachers, religious figures, a range of other folks to kind of look out for these, warning signs and risk factors and refer people who might be experiencing them to what's called either to law enforcement or what's called a threat assessment process, which is what they call a multidisciplinary team. But I think for our purposes, most importantly, incorporates law enforcement and involves law enforcement in the process of deciding what to do with a person who's maybe lashed out at their classmate or who's going through certain mental health issues or whatever the appropriate indicator might suggest. And then further downstream, and these raise a different set of equities, but further downstream, the government's also concerned about recidivism efforts. So looking at people in prison and trying to assess if they have radicalized, and then trying to ensure that that's not the case when they get out. So that's kind of like from the beginning to the end. It's all predicated on this sort of risk factors and indicators of violence framework.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Specifically, DHS uses this model of the stairway to terrorism, or just the general idea that there's some pathway to violence that's discoverable. So I was wondering if you could talk about how DHS frames these programs and what the data actually show.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So importantly, even the government's own studies to ground the CP3 program recognize that, and they present this as validating its violence prevention approach, but what these studies actually recognize is that there are no unambiguous indicators that someone is going to commit a terrorist attack, in part because it's just a very rare activity. And so that's one study by the RAND Corporation that they put forward that says that. There's also just the fact that another set of studies that the government relies on is produced by the U.S. Secret Service, and that in many of those studies they're looking basically backwards at a few dozen individuals who have committed attacks, which is too small of a sample size to generalize to the United States population of over 300 million people, and also. Those kinds of look backs are very much prone to confirmation bias. So you might look back and see that a kid had an interest in violent video games, for example, and then consider that relevant to the fact that they, eventually committed an attack, even though, that obviously is informed by sort of perceptions of who people think might be a school shooter. I think most importantly, though, to really underscore the point, these signs, whether it's being hopeless, alienated, having depression, having a grievance, having an extreme view, these are all conditions that millions and millions of Americans have. And so they're certainly not specific to people that end up going on to commit a violent attack.
Yeah, perfect. And jumping off of that, it's a good thing that CP3 has removed some of the obviously racist and Islamophobic markers, like wearing hijab or going to mosque more. But because the new indicators are so broad, you say in your report that they're often vague, broad, or both. That's another potential source of bias. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how these superficially neutral indicators can actually reinforce bias and white supremacy.
Yeah, look, it's a very well recognized, principle in the law that essentially rules that either encompass commonly occurring conduct, like speeding, for example, or rules that are just too, vague to be able to identify. So, for example, what is having a grievance? What rises to that threshold? Does that mean just being irritated at a classmate, or does that mean something more serious? It's really unclear. Or even social alienation. Does it mean having one friend, zero friends? What kind of family background, that sort of thing. The problem is the breadth and vagueness of these signs and indicators really opens the door for biases that are, racial biases in particular, that are really well documented, across our society. I mean, I think one good example, I brought up speeding. Obviously, certain, people from certain minority groups get pulled over for speeding a lot more frequently than others, or get pulled over for traffic stops. And that's just because there's a lot of discretion that are afforded to police on who to pull over, and it ends up impacting, certain groups of people. So in analogizing from that, I think, given these well-documented biases are shared across various sectors of society, and they, bear on how threatening, we perceive people to be, it's not necessarily the white supremacists that are going to likely bear the brunt of who's flagged as a potential threat.
Yeah, I really appreciate that analogy. I think that's helpful for understanding how top-line focus on white supremacy doesn't necessarily trickle down to who's reported to law enforcement and who has interactions with law enforcement as a result of these programs. And I have a related question about the markers that CP3 and other CVE programs supposedly think predispose people to violence.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked a bit about how this can embed bias into the system in terms of racial bias, but I was also interested in political bias because there's a fact that DHS sees certain ideologies as violence prone. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what effect this has on freedom of speech and assembly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, one of the indicators that the Department of Homeland Security has posited, I haven't seen specific ones tied to political views yet, although some of the intelligence reports coming out of the Intelligence and Analysis Office of the Department of Homeland Security suggest that that is going to be a focus. The issue is that when you say that a particular political view, like just in the CVE programs, for example, a concern about human rights or frustration with U.S. foreign policy overseas, is something that is potentially worthy of criminal suspicion. Obviously, that is going to chill speech and assembly and people's right to participate in a democracy. And also, obviously having a variety of opinions on things is what makes a democracy function effectively. Without having a robust debate, people can't make informed decisions, and political leaders can't be held accountable. I think the second kind of broader point that I would make about this is that, the Biden administration, for example, and it may well be in good faith, wants to focus on, white supremacists or far-right violence. But historically, the folks that have been, most targeted are people that, are really challenging state power. And for example, Martin Luther King was targeted by surveillance measures by the FBI. during the civil rights era. Radical ideas in the past, included women's suffrage, the 40-hour work week, other things that we would just consider pretty core moral principles at this point. And I think that point is especially accentuated when a lot of this strategy, the driving force behind it is the events of January 6th of this year. And, when we're thinking about, how to attribute blame or doing a look back at January 6th and we're tying, potentially strands of white supremacy to it, white supremacy is well represented at the highest levels of government. It's not really a challenge to state power. It's been with us for a long time. And so given that history, I think that, tying ideological views, which, by the way, it's well documented that they're not predictive of violence, as a potential source of criminal suspicion, I think is going to more impact, certain minority groups, marginalized folks, and people, essentially engaging in political dissent.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really helpful in understanding how these programs reinforce white supremacy, because unfortunately, white supremacy is not seen as extremism often. And so that presents a challenge for people. And I was wondering, you talked a lot about how these programs create de facto threat assessment teams out of more or less random untrained community members. And I was wondering if you could talk briefly about how bias runs through those.
Yeah, look, I mean, mental health professionals, police officers, teachers are all, susceptible to the same biases as the general population is, and that's very well documented. And especially when they're applying the same criteria to try to determine whether, for example, even let's say someone makes a threat, right, and then they're kind of diving into this analysis of do they come from a tough family background? Do they have friends at school? What do they like to do, and how does that bear on if they're a threat or not? Which is, quite frankly, based in junk science, but also is so there's really no sort of guiding rule that determines who falls on one side of the line and the other. And I think I think similar to the general population, that's serious concern for bias in terms of who gets referred to, whether it's social service or law enforcement. I think that's the same sort of rules I think apply in this context.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful in understanding how all these facially neutral programs can just reinforce white supremacy and propagate bias. And so we've seen the Biden administration, unfortunately, continue the same threads of CVE that the Obama administration started and the Trump administration continued. And so to close us out, I was wondering if there were any lessons you wish the Biden administration would take away from this about fighting terror, or anything else you'd like to share?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I think that my primary recommendation in this context is, look, I think it's important to underscore another harm that, aside from the impacts on free expression and speech and the potential disparate impacts, it's also the case that when you bring law enforcement closer to what are actually social issues, it's going to make it tougher for people who are actually experiencing those conditions to get help, right? If there's a cop on the threat assessment team, and let's say you're having a mental health issue, and you say something maybe bad to a classmate, having a police officer that's immediately at that intervention point is going to make it tougher for you to get help. It's going to make it tougher for you to trust the mental health professional that you referred to, or the counselor that you might need to see at a micro level. And you might also be less likely to proactively go do that. I think at the macro level, the Department of Homeland Security is administering these programs, and you got to ask, if you go to the DHS's website, right, there's like a bunch of helicopters and like guns and stuff. So like, what is it doing administering like funding an after school program for kids? If, certainly that program could be valuable, but, Department of Homeland Security is not an expert in what kinds of educational initiatives work, how resources should be allocated. They don't have the data or the expertise. And so they should definitely leave it to other actors, I think, even on the own premises of the violence prevention program, meaning that if those, even assuming that those factors, addressing those risk factors actually reduces violence, it would just be more effectively addressed by another set of agencies and walled off from law enforcement. But in terms of, I think that's like primarily the lesson that I would like the Biden administration to kind of take in, is that, social problems aren't the purview of law enforcement. And I think that was also a big theme of the anti-racism protests we saw last year. So I think it'd be good for them to heed that.
Thank you so much. And I do hope that the Biden administration takes notes from you. So thank you so much, Harsha. And I really appreciate you joining Defending Rights in Dissent for the first event in our new name, Same Flaws, examining Biden's misguided domestic extremism strategy. Thanks to Harsha and everyone who joined us today. Tune in next week, same day, same time. We're going to be with Fatima Ahmad to talk about how communities have resisted CVE and what that fight looks like now on the national level. So thank you again, Harsha, and thanks to everyone who joined us today.
Great. Thanks so much for organizing, Cody. Really appreciate it.